Part 14. Terror Broadcast. Author, Chunji Dixiaolong. Chapter 134. On the other side, the monks and the others actually drove a carriage to perform an empty city strategy. Subai didn't know, and Sean didn't know either. Both of them belong to the enhanced type of melee combat, and they don't have the ability to control the overall situation or sense the energy. What they are good at, and at this time, both of them are focusing on each other, which can be regarded as completely blocking the perception of the outside world. Whoever distracts others at this time is really an old man who eats arsenic and hates his life. Longer. Sean looked at his wolf claws and then at Subai's dagger. He was really a little scared. Originally, he was very confident in his wolf claws. He had no pressure to collide with the sword and could block bullets. But the opponent's dagger had already hit him hard, so he really didn't dare to use his wolf claws to resist Subai's dagger. At that moment, Sean took out a metal glove from his arms and put the fist on his right hand while observing Subai. Subai was not in a hurry to attack again. Blood was still flowing out from the opponent's waist. At this time, there was no need for him to take risks. He could just wait for the opponent to make the first move and then try his best. Anyway, he was already at an advantage. No need to take a desperate risk. After putting on the gloves, Sean was a little surprised that Subai didn't take this opportunity to attack him. This made all his previous assumptions come to nothing. However, Subai was right, and Sean really couldn't delay it. From now on, the longer the stalemate between the two sides lasts, the weaker Sean himself will become due to more and more blood loss. At that moment, Sean's chest muscles bulged, and then he rushed towards Subai. The speed was not very fast, but every step was solid, leaving no gaps, like a wolf king swooping towards his territory. This is enough to show the preciousness of Subai's previous attack. The opponent is actually not stupid. If it is really an equal situation and a battle, for Subai, it can only be said to be a 50-50 situation, and it will definitely not be as easy as now. In fact, if Sean was really just a reckless man with well-developed limbs and a simple mind, he would not be alive until now. These people may not even be able to pass the experience test, nor can they pass the real audience task. Under the heavy waves and bloody selection, no one who can reach this point is a real fool. Subai did not choose to charge head-on with the opponent. He did not even switch to the zombie state with the strongest physical defense and attack capabilities. He just started to retreat and wander around, giving his momentum to the opponent, and retreated to leeward. Sean rushed several times in a row, but failed to touch Subai's side, which finally made him feel a little angry, especially when he was still bleeding and the anger from the sneak attack before. He could still continue now. Maintaining absolute composure is already a bit unrealistic. After Subai noticed that Sean had increased his speed and the gaps began to be exposed, Subai began to become more and more calm, and at the same time, his eyes began to become more and more profound. Sean finally seized the opportunity to get close to Subai. He punched down with a strong wind, which could definitely knock out a person's brains. Subai used the 100 pi crossbar to hit it, and for a moment there was a sound of gold and iron colliding. When the news came out, sparks flew everywhere. Subai let out a muffled groan, and continued to retreat without releasing the terrifying force. Bapi was fine, not damaged at all, but his body found it difficult to withstand the force of the shock, and blood was already overflowing from the corner of his mouth. "It's hurt. Hee hee." Sean let out a low laugh and rushed over again. Now, he was full of absolute confidence. In fact, the other party relied on his carelessness at the beginning to successfully attack him. As long as he was serious, the other party would have no chance. At this time, Sean had already raised his speed completely, giving Subai no chance to dodge. Werewolves are very powerful, but speed is also one of their obvious advantages. This time, Subai rushed forward and took the initiative to meet him. The dagger stabbed Xiao En's neck directly. Xiao shook his head and leaned his shoulder towards Subai. Subai also subconsciously exerted force on his shoulder, but it's not that he wants to resist forcefully, but he lifts his feet off the ground at the same time, preparing to actively bear the opponent's impact so as to relieve the force. It's really too much to fight against a werewolf who is already charging and ready to go. Not wise anymore. Amidst the dull impact, Subai flew out and landed heavily on the ground. He covered his chest with one hand and couldn't get up. His face was very painful. What an arrogant Easterner. With this level of strength, you dare to take the initiative to attack me. I admire your courage, but I still want to take your life. Sean walked towards Subai step by step. At this time, although his waist was still bleeding, it didn't matter anymore. The battle was about to end, because in the impact just now, Sean was confident that he had broken Subai's ribs. How many sticks have been removed? How can it be that my strength can be removed so easily? The other party was seriously injured and even disabled. Subai coughed for a while, vomited out some blood clots, and then kept breathing heavily. He looked very haggard and tired, with strong unwillingness and anger in his eyes. Sean enjoyed this feeling very much. In fact, most people enjoyed this feeling. It had nothing to do with being a pervert or not. It was just the scene of enjoying the sight of his opponent struggling helplessly in front of him. For most people, it's all a beautiful scene. I will crush your bones and finally take off your head as my collection in this story world. Sean walked up to Subai, clasped Subai's shoulders with both hands, then lifted Subai up and started to exert force. Subai was almost curled up under the pressure of Sean's strength, and blood flowed from his nose. He almost gave up resistance completely, and became a belly. His eyes gradually became distracted, and he completely lost his fighting spirit. The carriage side is still in a stalemate. Mikkel didn't act rashly, and Pease and Jerry followed Mikkel's lead, so naturally they didn't move either. Moreover, now that Mikkel felt that Sean's aura was rising step by step, it was obvious that he had a good chance of winning, and he was able to calm down more and more. It seems that Abai is about to die over there, the fat man said a little worriedly. At the same time, he used his hand to scratch that part from time to time. At this time, it was hard and made him very uncomfortable. Men have this kind of feeling, when that thing gets hard, I really can't bear it without reaching out and grabbing the grapple a few times. This is the self-physiological instinct of most men. For example, many boys are doing things like hitting and flying. You understand it naturally, not someone else taught you. What made the fat man a little speechless was that he secretly observed the position of Gyatso and the monk. They were very calm. Why did he do it by himself? Could it be said that a monk can really be so pure and abstinent that he can even suppress his biological instincts? That's really terrible. Gyatso shook his head. No, he is waiting for an opportunity. The monk also echoed, it must be resolved quickly, otherwise it will be too detrimental to us if it drags on. After finishing speaking, the monk shouted loudly outside. Amitba, our mission is very tight and we don't have time to delay. Tell us what you mean. Mikkel just stood there with a smile and didn't reply. He was waiting for Sean over there to finish, and then they could decide together whether to stay or leave a carriage. Monk, what you said makes me feel like you're a bit arrogant, the fat man said, feeling unsure. The monk smiled nonchalantly and whispered, the poor monk is just setting the stage. Sean laughed almost wildly, listening to the sound of the bones rubbing in the other person's body, which made him very happy, as if it was the most beautiful music in the world. It's time to end. Sean subconsciously prepared to do his best to send Subai back to the west. However, at this moment, he saw a smile on the face of Subai who was close at hand. Then, Subai, who had lowered his head and waited for death, slowly raised his head. His eyes were so green that it made people panic. Roar. Zombie state. Breakout. Sudbai's aura burst out in an instant and became synonymous with filth and evil. At the same time, Sean's hands began to loosen uncontrollably, because it was unrealistic to try to crush Sudbai to death in such a simple and crude way, who had received the inheritance of the Zombie King's murderous aura. Sean's hands were forced to open, which was equivalent to exposing all his openings in front of Sudbai without reservation. Sudbai had endured it for so long. Wait. Isn't this just such an opportunity? The sharp zombie nails had grown out. Sudbai unceremoniously stabbed Sean's chest with all 10 fingers, and then pulled his hands outwards. Hiss. The flesh on Sean's chest was lifted open by Sudbai, revealing the ribs inside. Even in the werewolf-enhanced state, Sean couldn't withstand a sudden attack like Sudbai's. Sudbai was not satisfied with this result. Taking advantage of his illness. Kill him. Sudbai exposed his fangs and stretched directly towards Sean's chest. His teeth instantly bit Sean's ribs. Sean kept hitting Sudbai's back with both hands like crazy, but Sudbai's impact still made it impossible for him to get rid of Sudbai. In the end, Sudbai forcefully suppressed the huge Sean. Beneath him, his head kept beating on Sean's chest. Finally, the power of Sean's fists began to weaken and became weak. In the end, his hands spread out and fell loose on the ground, lifeless. Sudbai then raised his head. At this time, his face was stained with blood, as thick as if his face had been painted over and over again with red paint. He also had a piece of Sean's heart in his mouth. He stuck out his tongue, licked the blood on his face, then put his index finger into his mouth and sucked. Fulfilled. Laughed. Terror broadcast. Author, Chunji Dixiaolong. Chapter 135. Mikhail's smile gradually solidified, and a solemn look slowly appeared in his eyes. The feeling that he had everything under control and could act according to the opportunity was completely gone. Just now. The strong aura belonging to Sean suddenly stopped in an instant, and was replaced by a dirty and evil aura. Even a fool could guess what happened. Sean is dead, dead. He. In the carriage, the monk let out a crisp laugh, without much emotion, as if he just watched a movie and saw an interesting plot, and smiled knowingly. It was natural and not artificial. The fat man looked at the monk with admiration. Damn, this is the highest level of pretense. Is Sudbai coming over soon? Fatty muttered. Gyatso had his eyes closed, as if he was taking a nap. He was the most seriously injured. After all, in the Fulong Mountain Hall, a golden armored warrior fought hard. His legs were pierced by the opponent's spear, and one arm was broken. For the rest of the extra internal and external injuries, he really needs to rest at this time, but it is also a kind of certainty. The monk is still awake and can continue to hold on to the situation. Sudbai is coming, he can see it now, and it doesn't matter. Sudbai, who was covered in blood, walked here step by step, because the previous process of killing Sean was too bloody and violent, making his body seem to be soaked in blood, and even his leather boots came from here. However, a clear blood mark will be left. This is also due to the fact that Sean's plasma explosion was too powerful when he was in the werewolf state. If he were to kill ordinary people, he would never end up like this. When he got close to the carriage, Sudbai also noticed the 3 Westerners still standing in front of him. His heart changed and he knew that the monk was taking the initiative to sing about the empty city strategy. The monk once said before that it is very easy to communicate with smart people because many words do not need to be said and both parties can understand them. Although Sudbai's occasional mental illness gave the monk some headaches, made him suffer, and even made it difficult for him to understand, the monk never doubted that Sudbai was a smart person. Sudbai did not stop by the carriage, but walked straight towards the 3 Westerners, without even making eye contact, and without any attempt to get any hint from inside the carriage. Just keep moving forward naturally. Sudbai, who had just killed someone, seemed as if he had just performed his murder scene in one theater and then seamlessly walked into another theater and directly entered the role that his teammates had pre-designed without notifying him. After killing Sean, Subai's injury was not very serious, but it was definitely not too light. The previous several times of allowing Sean to take advantage of physical confrontations certainly had the effect of paralyzing Sean, but Subai himself was injured, and in an instant, he burst out with zombie blood and hit with all his strength. For Subai himself, the consumption was also very high. At this time, he was not suitable for a new round of fighting, and the opponent would no longer underestimate the enemy. He is not in peak condition, and the three people in the carriage who were originally considered very powerful are all disabled now. The Westerner at the front was holding a magic wand. The aura of magical elements on his body made Subai dislike him very much. He was probably a magician, and judging from where he stood and the attitude of the other two towards him, he should be the leader. The body muscles at the back are almost horribly exaggerated, they may be strengthened by barbarians or giants, and as for the one holding the bow and arrow, they should be elves. These are relatively popular and common strengthening systems in the West, and are not very similar to the strengthening systems in the East. This is actually related to the culture of the Eastern and Western worlds and the relationship between adapting to local conditions. For example, Fatty's Taoist strengthening and Monk and Gyatso's Buddhist strengthening. They can find something suitable for themselves from their own sects or from some secret realms in China. And opportunities, and vice versa in the West. If you want to find a Christian church with a history of more than 1,000 years or the coffin of a certain vampire archduke and elf queen in China, it is almost like a fantasy. Fortunately, Subai himself has zombie blood, otherwise he is purely a vampire. In China, it is difficult to get any opportunities suitable for vampires. Mikhail raised the wand in his hand. The magic element was already brewing, and the surrounding wind gradually became more substantial. Wind blades were ready to be unleashed on Subai at any time. The spells of wind magic echoed around, the magic elements began to beat rhythmically, and the chilling aura began to gather, all because of the Oriental man in front of him who was walking step by step. Pisa's bow and arrow shone brightly, and the natural power of the elf was concentrated on the arrow, aiming at Subai. His fingers remained motionless, showing an extremely high level of archery skills. At the same time, his eyes seemed to be growing. It is holding a falcon, its pupils are made up of a mixture of several colors, making it look very strange. Gil's nostrils were filled with hot breath, and he stared at Subai, and power began to surge in his body. The scene was actually quite peaceful. Except for the footsteps of Subai walking towards the three people step by step with a calm expression, there was no unnecessary sound. However, it is this kind of rhythmic and firm footsteps that invisibly condenses a kind of momentum. Coupled with Subai's current bloody image, the image is indeed very strong. Return. The monk's deep voice came from the carriage, like a captain scolding his disobedient team members, but he had a good sense of proportion, with the light scolding of his disobedient team members, and at the same time it also reflected a disdain for Westerners. This is like a stage play, which requires people to act and narration to connect. Subai is the actor and the monk is the narration. What both parties have to do is to completely raise the atmosphere and momentum, so that these three Western audiences dare not act rashly. But Subai did not come back, and continued walking forward, already closing the distance between himself and the Westerner to within 20 meters. At this distance, the magician's wind blade could hit Subai with his eyes closed, the elf's arrows would basically not miss, and the barbarian's impact would not leave much time for the opponent to react. However, Mikhail didn't move. He didn't move. Naturally, Peas and Ja wouldn't move either. Subai grinned, revealing his white teeth. Uncoagulated blood on his face began to seep into his lips. He didn't care, and even went to lick it deliberately. At the same time, Subai also put his hand into his arms. Pisa's bow and arrows were instantly fully loaded when Subai did this action. Mikhail suddenly raised his hand to signal Pisa not to act rashly. Pisa nodded slightly, took a deep breath, and calmed down. What Subai took out was half of Sean's liver. To be honest, Subai didn't have any abnormal habits of the special envoy. He only had an instinctive desire for blood when he was injured because of the blood that restored the body. Normally, he wouldn't. He enjoys sucking blood. In fact, when his body is in good condition, Subai is a little averse to sucking blood. So, putting this aside, as a vampire and a zombie, some of Subai's behaviors and habits can be considered very self-disciplined and ethical. However, this cannot be the case now. Holding Sean's liver in his hand, Subai smiled and reached out to touch it, then stretched out his tongue to lick it. The fat man in the carriage saw the scene through the gaps in the curtain. He immediately covered his mouth and let out a very low retching sound in his throat. Ugh, I can't stand it anymore, monk, I can't stand it anymore. This, mother, is so disgusting. The baby really can't hold it anymore. The monk's face looked as usual, and Gyatso was smiling. After a while, the fat man finally recovered. Then he took a peek and found that Subai had actually opened his mouth and took a bite of the bloody liver, chewing it with great enjoyment. This time, the fat man did not vomit again, but silently reached out and touched his forehead, saying sadly, "You think, if he runs away by himself, can he escape? Well, although I think it is very difficult, because the little baby is still on our carriage, and he is not Changshan Zhao Zilong who can lead a do all the way out. Well, I can use many kinds of interests and reasons to explain his current behavior. Although he is a psychopath, he doesn't have this habit of eating corpses. Okay, I won't talk nonsense. I really have some small touch." The monk ignored the fat man's soliloquy. He just continued to observe the situation. When he needed to speak up, he would speak up. At this time, Subai had already eaten half of the liver in front of the three Westerners. The monk he finally spoke. "We still have things to do, and I don't have time to continue playing here with you. If you continue like this, we will leave first and see who eats whose flesh in the end, if you fight against the three of them alone." When Subai heard this, he bared his teeth at the carriage behind him and let out a low growl of dissatisfaction in his throat. It was obvious that he was not satisfied with the will imposed on him by the people in the carriage. Then, Subai turned his head and looked at the three Westerners in front of him. He stuck out his tongue and licked his lips, showing a salivating and greedy look. This look, this expression, made Pisa's hands start to tremble slightly, and he almost couldn't control himself and shot the arrow out. Fortunately, he still controlled it. Ah! Subai angrily tore the remaining half of the liver into pieces with both hands, then took a few steps forward and threw it all in Mikhail's face. Snap, snap, snap. A series of crisp sounds came out. Mikhail's face was covered with blood, but he remained motionless, only his breathing became much heavier. "Forget it if you don't leave, you disobedient thing." The monk issued an ultimatum, and then the little guy sitting on the deck of the carriage made a sound of "yay ya ya yo." The horse turned around obediently and gradually left here with the carriage. Subai looked back at the carriage bitterly, and finally left with the carriage angrily. The three Westerners stood there until the carriage gradually became blurry in their sight. Then Peace put down his bow and arrow. He said to Mikhail, "Mikhail, your previous analysis was correct. We have killed all the weak Eastern listeners, and the rest are all guys who are not easy to mess with. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment." Terror Broadcast. Author, Chunji Dixiaolong. Chapter 136. After entering the county town, we found an inn and stayed. Although there were 4 rooms, the 4 grown men still stayed in one room. After all, the monk, Gyatso and the fat man were all semi-disabled, and Subai was the only one. A new force, Subai didn't watch them. It would be a big loss if something happened to these 3. He worked hard to bring them back, for the next step of the plot, and also for them to owe him a favor. In the world of the story, you can make calculations and calculations, it doesn't matter, but some accounts must be calculated clearly. For example, this favor is considered real, not included in the calculation of interests, and exists independently of this outside. Whoever wants not to owe this favor must kill or silence the other 3 people, otherwise they will become a street rat in this small circle. Of course, Subai actually didn't think so much about killing them. Bringing them back together is just because it would be a pity to see them lying there without caring. It would be better to bring them back and have a debt of gratitude. If they are willing to pay back, it will be considered a profit. If they don't pay back, there will be no loss. I am nothing more. It takes a little effort. That night, Gyatso, who was most seriously injured, lay on the bed to rest. The monk leaned against the wall and sat cross-legged in meditation. Subai and the fat man made the floor. The tired people woke up one after another in the morning of the next day. Of course, people here slept with one eye open, and they didn't just sleep heartlessly to death. The fat man's injuries were mainly due to the terrible wound on his chest and the damage done to his soul by the knife, so he still maintained a certain degree of mobility. After getting up in the morning, this guy went directly to the stairs and went downstairs. Then he took the money and asked the waiter to follow him. He went out to buy food together, and then asked the waiter to help him deliver the food he bought to the room upstairs. There were not many things, and they were not very rich. They were just soy milk, fried dough sticks, meat and vegetable buns. The fat man only wanted a round belly at this time, and he didn't ask for anything else. After washing up, Gyatso and the monk also sat together and started to eat some. Just eat slower. The fat man swallowed a bun, wiped the oil from his mouth, and asked curiously, "What's wrong? You're not even hungry?" "I'm almost full." "Why do you eat so much? Are you really a monk who has purified the 6 sense organs and has already reached the realm of Anidya?" Gyatso and the monk laughed without saying a word and continued to eat slowly. After the fat man was completely full, he lay down on the bed, feeling very satisfied. At this time, Subai, who had not appeared during breakfast, came back with 2 food boxes in his hand. He opened the food boxes and saw that they were from a well-known local restaurant. The snacks they bought were all exquisitely made, but the ones Fatty bought were obviously not up to par. I guess Subai went out after Fatty went out, and said hello to Gyatso and Monk. So Gyatso and Monk he deliberately waited with his stomach open, and he didn't even tell the fat man. You didn't bring such a thing, and you didn't tell me when you went out to buy snacks." "I was already full." The fat man was lying on the bed and was a little tearful. In fact, he had eaten 2 bowls of Yangchun noodles outside before coming back. In ancient times, there was only this kind of enjoyment for food and drink, and there was not much else. Anyway, we had enough money before, and we couldn't bring out the world of the story, so why bother saving? Subai gave a snack to the little guy. He took a bite and it was so sweet that he narrowed his eyes with laughter. The fat man also forgot about this incident. When a person is full, no matter how delicious the food is, it will not be very attractive to him. The fat man waved his hand and asked, "Are we planning to live here for a long time, or are we leaving today?" Subai took a sip of tea and said, "You can hide it for a while. After eating these things and packing some daily necessities and herbs, we will set off directly at noon. Even if we are not in a hurry to go to the demon cave first, we can go to the outside of the county for casual, find a deserted place to stay for a while. It is estimated that in 4 or 5 days, you will be able to recover to some extent to 30 to 40%. At least you will not be able to fight those Westerners like you did yesterday. Nothing. The monk also nodded, it's better to be cautious. Subai is right. They are not stupid. They were frightened by us once by chance. They will definitely try it again for the second time. Let's leave this densely populated place in the county as soon as possible. Go in a barren mountain and with a few formations to block the aura. Even if they have any special tracking methods, it will be difficult to find us. Okay, then I'll squint for a while and then continue running. The fat man immediately crossed his legs and began to take a nap. The most important thing for him was to nourish his soul again, otherwise the soul would be damaged and the Taoism would not be able to activate it. For him, he would almost become a useless person. Gyatso is a bit more troublesome. Even if he begins to control his own flesh and blood and endures severe pain to promote the growth and healing of his bones, he does not have vampire blood like Subai, so the speed will definitely be very slow, and how much can he recover? It's hard to say yet. The monk's problem is more complicated. Both his body and soul are traumatized. But looking at the monk's appearance, he looks the best among the three. It's hard to guess how much he can recover. Once everyone has eaten and drank enough, and the remaining food has been packed, we are ready to trigger it again. Subai carried most of the things on his back, and Subai used a cloth bag to hang the little guy on his chest. The fat man opened the door to the room first and walked out, followed by the others, with Subai walking last. "Master, are you leaving?" the waiter greeted the fat man downstairs. He obviously got to know the fat man this morning. Subai suddenly raised his hand. "Wait." The fat man was stunned for a moment, and he didn't hesitate. Not only did he stop his feet, he also took several steps back. Gyatso, who was on crutches, also turned around and looked at Subai. The monk looked down, then around, and asked with some confusion, "What did you find?" "Go back to the room first and pretend like nothing happened." "Fatty, ask the kid to make tea." After saying that, Subai re-entered the room carrying large and small bags. The monk and Gyatso followed back calmly. The fat man stood at the top of the stairs and deliberately shouted at the waiter to make up for the tea quickly. It's unnatural to wait for someone to go out and then go back in again. All four people returned to the room, and the fat man closed the door. The eyes of Gyatso, the monk, and the fat man then fell on Subai. Subai put the little guy on the bed first, and then said seriously, "There was a table of diners eating downstairs just now. They look familiar to me." "Looks familiar," Fatty muttered, "have you seen it somewhere when you entered the story world?" Subai nodded, "I have indeed seen it." "Is there anything special?" Fatty is not stupid either. Subai must have a special reason for sending everyone back so solemnly, and it couldn't be a sign of being a warrior. Otherwise, he would be underestimating the psychological quality of everyone present. Moreover, Subai yesterday he also showed the ability to eat human livers raw. This psychological quality has already led him further and further towards mental illness. I remember that the people at that table were wearing beggars' clothes and cooking beggars' chicken outside the county town yesterday. Today they are all wearing expensive clothes and sitting downstairs to eat. I don't think they were playing cosplay yesterday. Hearing this, everyone present fell silent. Yesterday, Subai was relatively close to the beggars, so no one else could see them clearly. Later, they met Westerners, so everyone focused their attention on them. Westerners. Of course, the most important thing is that if you happen to be a beggar there yesterday, and now you suddenly become a noble diner eating downstairs in the inn where you and others live, there will be too much intrigue here, even a bit, it's shocking. Could it be said that these Westerners, who have been rising again and again, are not the main dishes prepared by the terrorist broadcasts for us? In fact, we have not discovered the real main dishes before. The fat man shook the empty teacup, and then he pursed his lips and said, "If this is the case, this story world is really exciting, but there is one thing that is very wrong. If they have a complete grasp of our whereabouts, and based on this calculation, yesterday's confrontation with the Westerners was not a deliberate temptation on their part. But wanting to eat beggar's chicken was something I came up with on the spur of the moment. How could they know that when our carriage passed there, I would suddenly be craving for beggar's chicken and ask you, Subai, to get it for me? Gyatso also spoke at this time. They may be just a special group of people, but yesterday, it was probably a coincidence that they happened to run into a small-scale fight between us and Westerners. The monk tapped his fingers on the table. He had been silent before. At this time, he slowly said, "It doesn't make sense, it doesn't make sense. Because there were too many coincidental factors in what happened yesterday, Subai has now discovered that the other party has actually been staring at him and others for a long time. With subjective factors, he can combine subjective factors and objective factors together. Triggering the coincidental fight yesterday was a bit too incredible, even a bit unimaginable." Dong dong dong. There was a knock on the door. "Sir, the tea you want." "Come in," the fat man shouted. The waiter came in, brought the tea, and then closed the door as he left. At this time, Subai picked up the teapot and poured all the water in it on the table. The fat man narrowed his eyes, poisoned. Subai shook his head honestly. "I don't know, but the waiter who greeted you when we went out has now been replaced by them. One of the diners who was wearing nice satin clothes just now dressed up as the waiter will bring us tea." The monk looked at Subai. "Are you really wrong?" "That's right. The original waiter greeted me when I came back. He said that a very fat friend of mine had bought breakfast and came back, and he also very politely invited him to eat a bowl of noodles outside. That did the waiter spill some soup on himself when he went out with you today?" The fat man nodded. "Yes, he spilled the soup on himself while eating noodles. The waiter who just brought tea in has changed, but his clothes have not changed," Subai said firmly. "That is, from the time we went out to the time we came back and sat here, the table where we were eating was changed. One of the diners had already changed into a real waiter's clothes and came over to serve us tea. The public account Kongbu 66 does exist. You can click on WeChat, click Add Friend in the upper right corner, and then search for Kongbu 66 and follow it." Terror Broadcast. Author, Chunji Disyao. Chapter 137. There was a brief silence in the room, which even seemed a little depressed. This kind of pressure was different from the embarrassment caused by one's own injuries when facing Westerners. Westerners were just a nuisance, not much pressure. Those mysterious people Subai mentioned, because of mystery, because of unknown, because of infiltration step by step. What it brings is really a solid sense of oppression. It's like dark clouds rolling in on the sea. Could it be a new wave of NPCs? Fatty began to analyze. There is a game I don't know if you have played. Monk and Gyatso probably haven't played it. Abai, you should have played it. It's called Rogue Speed Car. In the context of a city game, you control a person to do tasks. Of course, you can also kill people, set fires, steal cars, and drive around. The first few generations of this game were actually very rough. For example, in the city background, there were only a few types of pedestrians and cars. Wherever the protagonist of the game went, he could see the same pedestrians and the same cars in many corners of the city, constantly spinning and moving. In later generations, with the improvement of game development level, NPC facial expressions have been greatly improved, but this problem still exists. After all, if you want to set all the cars and pedestrians in a city to look different, then it would be a massive project and unrealistic. Subai smiled and said, "Fat man, you mean what went wrong with the horror broadcast and confused these NPCs? It means that the beggars who were beggars yesterday were one group of people, and those who were eating downstairs today are the same group. The people at the table are from another group of people, and the waiter who just served tea is from another group of people, but because of the problem of the terrorist broadcast itself, they looked the same. The fat man nodded, "We can't rule out this reason." The monk directly retorted, "At this time, terrorist broadcasts will make mistakes, but they will not make such obvious mistakes. There is no need to doubt this. Its mistakes may be caused by us on Fulong Mountain, for example. It ends inexplicably, but the traces of error are just a feeling we have inferred, and we will never be able to find any obvious evidence. If you say that even the NPC sidekicks in its story world can get their faces wrong, that would be an underestimation of horror broadcasting. Yes, this should not be the mistake of the terrorist broadcast, and it will never be the mistake of the terrorist broadcast. Even if a supreme existence makes a mistake, it will only make mistakes at its level. It will not make mistakes so conspicuously. We observe it directly with the naked eye. I agree more with Subai's point of view. We were stared at by a group of mysterious people, but for some unknown reason, they did not attack us directly. Instead, they chose to observe and follow us, and even did not hesitate to disguise themselves as waiters. Just to observe us from a further distance. Stop guessing. How about we grab a tongue and ask, the fat man suggested. Then, the fat man found that the other people's eyes were on him, and they were looking at him with a look. The fat man smiled bitterly, "Haha, this is unrealistic. I'm just kidding, haha. How can it be so simple to catch a person's tongue? The surveillance on him and others is already pervasive. At this time, it is too natural to think of catching one of them for questioning. Not to mention whether he can succeed is still a matter of debate. If he succeeds, his accomplices will probably be killed before he can be tied up with a rope and tortured for questioning. In this way, what is the point of questioning? It's better to just declare a break and start a war. Now is not the time to break up. If they are willing to follow, they can continue to follow. Let's seize the time to recover. No matter what happens or unexpected, our own strength is the most fundamental reliance." "Subai, do you think we should continue to move now?" the monk said. Subai smiled and said, "With this bunch of bullies here, it's meaningless where we go. Since they are not ready to take action now, let's just stay here and save the trouble. Take your time and take a few more breaths. Okay, let's go back to sleep." The fat man didn't care about anything else and lay back on the bed to take a nap. The little guy who was originally put on the bed by Subai climbed on the fat man's belly. The fat man was not angry, but deliberately bumped his belly to play with him. The kid's closest friend was Subai, and he also played well with the fat man. But he is very indifferent to the monk and Gyatso, and usually does not even give a smile. Obviously, although the little guy looks like a child crawling around with his butt naked, his heart is also very clear and pure. The monk and Gyatso wanted to eat him at first, so naturally they don't want to eat him now. How can I be on good terms with them? Gyatso sat on the ground again. After entering meditation, the sound of bones rubbing continuously came from his body. He was obviously suffering from huge pain, but he also used this method to speed up the healing of his bones. The monk was not in a hurry. He brought out the old tea and poured a cup of herbal tea for himself and Subai. The two sat in silence. About half an hour later, the monk was a little tired. He rested his chin with one hand and fell asleep sitting at the table. However, Tian Ran's posture made Subai feel very strange. This was something that could not be explained in words. Feel. Everyone has their own things to keep at the bottom of the box, and among the four, the monk obviously has the most secrets. Subai didn't pay attention to this. He stood up and saw that the little guy was already lying on the fat man's belly and taking a nap with the fat man. Although there were 4 adults and 1 child inside, it seemed very quiet and you could hear a pin drop. Subai opened the back window of the room. Outside was a forest, very quiet. Just leaning against the window edge and looking into the distance, Subai was in a daze for a while unconsciously. Then, wherever he looked, he discovered that there were subtle crisp sounds coming from the forest. He acted as if nothing had happened. He closed the window quietly, then stood on one side of the window, secretly looking outside through the gap in the paper window. It seemed that Subai closed the window and let the people outside breathe a sigh of relief. They finally started to move again. Immediately afterwards, in Subai's line of sight, a group of Qing soldiers wearing armor and swords appeared, and these Qing soldiers were obviously not the local green camp or ordinary soldiers. The chill atmosphere of their command and prohibition, even through this distance at a glance, Subai could feel it very clearly. But after these people got close, they all hid in the woods and made no more movements. But Subai knew that things were not that simple anymore. If it was said that those mysterious people were just monitoring every move of himself and others, it would be okay for the time being. It doesn't matter, but the approach of these soldiers means that there may not be much time before they take action. Those mysterious people may have special abilities to slowly lurk, and these soldiers are all ordinary people. How can such a large group of people play something like lurking for a long time? The monk who had taken a nap also woke up at this time, walked behind Subai, and asked. The poor monk smells murderous intent. Subai pointed to the window. There is a group of soldiers coming outside. There are quite a few people. Visually, there are at least 300 to 400 people here. If the other party is encircling them, there are probably nearly 1,000 people. They are planning to take action. The monk also looked solemn. It's a pity that we can't wait one more day. By waiting one more day, everyone will recover a little more strength, and they will be able to deal with it more calmly. A group of mysterious people are responsible for monitoring us. Now there is a group of Qing soldiers outside. Monk, what did you think of? Subai asked. The monk pondered for a moment. It is said that the founders of the Qing dynasty, Nara and Qi, found the dragon veins of the Jurchens, so they were able to raise an army with 13 pairs of armor and finally make a fortune. During this period, in the background of the story world under the circumstances, since there are truly Taoist masters like Lin Zhenying, there are many monsters in the demon cave. There are also demons on Fulong Mountain and the Taoist law field that already exists. How could the imperial court in this secular world not keep captives of its own? A group of masters have risen up. It's similar to what I thought. We have always ignored them, so we just kept away from the eyes of ordinary people, but we were still noticed by others. The fact that they can call for the Qing troops to come over can be regarded as confirming their identity. Those mysterious people can confirm our location in advance and even deduce some of what we are going to do. There should be people inside who are good at deduction, but it is impossible to say that there is no exhaustive plan. At least, they probably didn't figure it out. You have already remembered their faces, even if they were still beggars at that time. If I had known better, we could have just gone all the way to the demon cave. If we were delayed here, we would have been caught in a trap. Subai teased, and then shook his head. It doesn't make any sense, since people can pretend to be beggars and wait outside the city. It means that people have accurate information about our location for a long time, and they can intercept us wherever they go. Actually, it's right to enter the city. The other party is obviously a bit wary. Otherwise, it would be impossible to give us an extra day to breathe. After all, this is not the time when the Qing dynasty just entered the customs. Things like the 3 massacres in Jiading on the 10th in Yangzhou are happening. I could still do it when I first entered the customs, but now it is no longer suitable, and they are also afraid that people like us will go crazy in the end and the impact will be too big. Just as Subai and Fatty were chatting with each other, the violent sound of fighting and friction suddenly came from outside. Subai leaned over and looked outside, and found that the Qing soldiers who had just lurked over were receding like the tide, and behind them at the market entrance over there was a faint cry of killing. Subai simply opened the window and looked out, and saw a man waving a magic wand on the opposite street. Groups of Qing soldiers swarmed in, but many of them were killed and injured by the wind blade. Oh, those Westerners stepped on the thunder first. Subai pointed to the group of Qing soldiers who swarmed up but fell to the ground like leeks, and said, "Monk, does the scene look like it? Was it when the Senglinkan cavalry charged at the British and French gun formations?" The monk shook his head and said, "It's different." Sure enough, as soon as the monk finished speaking, several diners wearing expensive clothes who were eating on the ground floor of the inn where Subai was staying came out of the air with long swords in hand, pointing directly at the Western magician. "Chi refiner," the monk confirmed, "this is really a messy story world, with all the cows, ghosts, and snakes." Terror broadcast. Author, Chunji Dixiaolong. Chapter 138. Ancient Qi refiners were not necessarily Taoist priests, but a considerable number of Taoist priests could be subdivided into Qi refiners. These Taoist Qi refiners and ordinary Qi refiners together constitute the cultivation group of Qi refiners. They are somewhat similar to ascetics among Buddhists. They eat the wind and drink the dew. They only seek for themselves and do not use external elixirs and other means to improve their cultivation. They practice the 5 qi in the chest instead of the golden elixir. From ancient times to the present, there are countless qi refiners who rely on the emperor's family to cling to the emperor's dragon energy. Each dynasty has typical examples and famous figures. This is also because this emperor's dragon energy is very important to them. The horror broadcasts are becoming more and more difficult to understand. I suddenly miss the story worlds of the past. In the current story world, I always feel that there are some inexplicable things, and even the Chi Master can come out. Subai reached out and touched his chin. He hadn't shaved since he entered the story world, and now his beard had grown, which was a bit prickly. It is estimated that there will be some changes. After all, it is actually somewhat unable to control the development of this type of story world. The story worlds that Jian Monk experienced before were also based on supernatural and thriller themes. The pace is very fast. What needs to be done to find out the clues and distinguish between ourselves and the enemy, instead of constantly encountering and searching in a vast empty area like now? Monk, you are hesitant to speak. Of course, Subai heard that the monk only said half of what he said and hid the other half. In fact, all listeners in the real world have now received a message from the public account Kongbu 66. The horror broadcast will be suspended for 3 months. During these 3 months, no more missions will be released. Of course, the audience who are still in the story world have to continue to complete the existing tasks, and they do not know this news. You should be able to feel these things yourself. The monk looked at Subai. The horror broadcast is actually trying to try a new story theme. Sometimes, we can really treat it as a so-called real story. As a radio program in the sense of the word, it has been working hard for its own storytelling. You should be very clear about this. In fact, most listeners with a little experience can clearly understand that in the last 1 or 2 story worlds, it has begun to try this different storyline from the past, but the effect is not very good, because it shapes the more complex the story world is, the more uncontrollable forces it faces. Many times, its will cannot be fully implemented and executed, which often leads to self-defeation. The most obvious point is that some characters may be created by it in order to enrich the world environment of this story. However, these people or objects will not be controlled by it, but will go against its will. On Fulong Mountain, the poor monk already had this feeling. Walking a long distance to pick up a child felt like a tourist adventure. Step by step, he went deeper and deeper, and in the end, he encountered one level after another in a dense manner. Danger, Gyatso, Fatty, and I were all severely injured in such a short distance. This rhythm and pattern are a bit boring and monotonous. The poor monk thinks that this is by no means the story that the horror broadcast wants, but what actually happened was the opposite of what it was planned to be. You mean, that demon? Subai's eyes narrowed. Although the two of them seemed to be just chatting, the content was already pointing to some core existences of the horror broadcast. This is not a stupid thing where a firefly dares to compete with the bright moon. Compared to the universe, human beings are not even the size of a grain of dust, but they can still analyze and calculate the orbits of many planets. Although Sudbai and Monk the current position is not very high, but it does not prevent them from making some speculations and assumptions about horror broadcasts. The devil was created by it, and it should probably be very satisfied, but how could a real devil follow other people's arrangements and become a puppet? Horror broadcasting is trying to build a complex and complete story world, but it doesn't. It has the ability to create a real world, unless it is willing to create a world and completely loosen its influence on the world. Of course, this is also impossible. Once it cannot control the story world, then the audience will really I'm here to travel. When the monk said this, a very desolate roar came from outside. It was the roar of the barbarians. Then, a series of harsh breaking sounds came, and a large number of Qing soldiers from the surrounding area quickly reinforced the location. The surroundings suddenly became very empty. Sudbai clapped his hands and shouted, "Everyone, get ready to run away." Before, I was actually waiting for a better opportunity. Gyatso was not sleeping, while Fatty was half asleep and half awake. They were both paying attention to the situation outside. "Does a dog bite a dog over there?" Fatty said, a little surprised. "There should be something wrong in the middle, or maybe this is the main mission of Westerners." Sudbai analyzed that since entering the story world, first there was the Demon Cave, then Lin Zhenying, then the Zombie Cave, and then Fulong Mountain. My group of people have gone through enough story missions. I think these Manchuchi refiners should not prepare dishes specially for me and others, but for these Western audiences. "Don't take anything, get away first," the monk said while looking at the situation outside. "Just go out from the window. All the soldiers here have gone to reinforce over there. Sudbai, the poor monk, and you are here after the break." Sudbai didn't say anything. The monk probably didn't recover much, but he was the one in the best condition. His willingness to break up with him was a decision that Sudbai couldn't refuse. "Get out of the way, I'll go down first." The monk and the fat man stepped aside from the window. Sudbai climbed out of the window first and then landed on the ground. In fact, the height of the building was not very high. Sudbai looked downstairs to make sure there was nothing wrong, and waved to the top to indicate that he could come down. The fat man grabbed the window edge and came down along the pillar, while Gyatso came down with his body pressed against the wall. Sudbai also noticed that Gyatso was not using a cane, which proved that he had regained his ability to move, but he was probably still some time away from fighting. Distance. The monk came down last, but just as he was about to climb out of the window, he suddenly turned his head and turned sideways. A sharp sword flew directly out of the window, and then the sound of fighting came from the room. The little guy was riding on the fat man's shoulders, and he was very obedient and didn't make any noise. It seems that the other side also knew that we were going to escape, so they held us back first. Gyatso looked at the window sill. "There is a river after passing the forest here. You go along the river," Sudbai told the fat man. "Watch the children." The fat man touched the little guy's head on his shoulder and smiled honestly. "I want to be this child's godfather, don't worry." Sudbai rushed forward again, grabbed the eaves with both hands and pulled his whole body up, then stepped on the tiles and entered through the window of the next room. Fatty and Gyatso took advantage of this opportunity to get into the forest. Sudbai was still quite confident whether the two of them could escape smoothly. A skinny camel was bigger than a horse. Of course, the premise was that it's enough to hold back what these monks call the Manchuchi refiners for a while. Go into the next room and then come out. At the entrance of the corridor, the monk is swept out by a diner with a sword. The monk leans on the railing. It can be seen that the monk is very reluctant now and can only parry, but it is enough to let him go. Sudbai was surprised. This monk had recovered so much without saying a word. Which temple had cultivated such a profound monk? However, the monk really couldn't hold it anymore. This Chirifiner was fair and tender, and wore clothes similar to those of a member of the military. It seemed that it didn't match his temperament, but there was an ethereal air in every move. Breath. He had no intention of killing him, and his intention to catch him alive was obvious, but neither Sudbai nor the monk would give him this chance. The monk had noticed Sudbai's arrival, clasped his hands together and recited Amitabha. When the Buddha's voice reached his ears, the Chirifiner's body suddenly shook, his eyes closed, and he felt dizzy for a moment. Sudbai rushed over immediately, holding Bapi tightly in his hand, and his body quickly switched to zombie state, and his energy was immediately raised to the strongest level. Although the Chi master had his eyes closed, he still had a keen sense of danger. The sword in his hand flew up and stabbed Sudbai actively. This is the flying sword protector. On one side of Sudbai's body, the flying sword grazed his chest, causing a string of sparks. At the same time, Sudbai felt a burning pain in his chest. Then, Sudbai finally got close to the Chirifiner and stabbed with the dagger toward the other person's chest. The Chi master pushed out his palms, and Chi was surging. Sudbai felt as if his chest had been hit by a car, and his whole body was knocked over. However, at this moment, Bapi was also knocked over by Sudbai. Bai threw it out. The Chirifiner opened his eyes were shining brightly, and he looked at the oncoming Bapi with a calm expression. He raised his left hand, raised his index finger and ring finger, and clamped Bapi. Then it seems that after the chi of the Chirifiner was actively instilled into Bapi according to his habit of wielding a sword, just like the zombie king last time injected his evil spirit into Bapi, the demonic energy inside Bapi immediately fluctuate. In fact, the demonic energy within Bapi has been completely depleted in the last duel against the zombie king. This time the demonic energy fluctuation is more like a kind of final afterglow, but the problem lies in this Chirifiner. Shishi held the dagger between his two fingers. The friction and collision of the demonic energy made his fingers numb, and his two fingers were bounced away. Bapi, who still had enough energy, continued to fly out in the designated direction. Puff. Bapi stabbed into the Chirifiner's neck. This. The Chirifiner staggered back and forth, and finally leaned against the wall, with a look of disbelief and confusion on his face. Finally, he fell to the ground slumped, lifeless. Sudbai, who was knocked to the ground, stood up with great difficulty, holding his chest. Looking at the ending, he walked to the body of the Chirifiner and pulled out his dagger. I told you to pretend, to be cool. You are listening to novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Terror Broadcast. Author, Chunji Dixiaolong. Chapter 139. Checking the body to see if there is anything worth collecting was Sudbai's follow-up procedure after killing someone. However, what made Sudbai a little disappointed was that except for a flying sword, there was nothing else on the body except the clothes on the body. Not even a piece of jewelry. This kind of Chirifiner is no different from an ascetic. He doesn't join the emperor's family for fame and wealth, but for the trace of the emperor's dragon chi. The monk coughed and said to Sudbai. Sudbai took the sword in his hand. There were some lines on the sword, which should be formations. However, it was of little use to Sudbai, but it would be different in the hands of others. Sudbai remembered, in this story world, I got a magic wand. Sophia also said that she would contact her to go to London to trade with him. The quality of this flying sword must not be high. After all, this is not a fairy story world, but it is not bad, and it is far away. Needless to say, the fat man is probably also very eager to get it, so he can exchange this for something with the fat man when the time comes. The monk didn't want to compete with Sudbai for the sword. He looked at the entrance of the inn, and there were already sounds of horse hooves there. It was obvious that a group of cavalry had arrived. There are still a lot of people. Sudbai pursed his lips. Can we retreat now, or should we block them again? The monk shook his head and said, let's withdraw. If those Westerners can't hold on for long and we continue to stay here, we will be surrounded and we won't be able to get out even if we want to. 2. Sudbai climbed out of the window, followed closely by the monk. The two of them went downstairs together. After landing on the ground, a group of cavalry from the side not far away spotted the two of them and had already galloped towards them. Go into the forest and run separately. Sudbai looked at the monk. You should be fine, right? The monk also knew what Sudbai meant. He felt that he still had something to hide, so he simply went his own way. On the surface, they were divided into two groups, but in fact, it was Sudbai's dissatisfaction with him for hiding his strength. The two men ran separately. The cavalry behind hesitated for a moment, then divided into two groups and continued to chase. Sudbai was followed by more than a dozen cavalrymen. Fortunately, this was a forest. The cavalrymen could not increase their speed and could not create any encirclement. Sudbai could still maintain the distance between himself and the people behind him. It was not that Sudbai was afraid of the dozen or so people behind him. There is only one cavalry, but if you are entangled and more Qing soldiers gather, you don't need too many. Just 100 or so people can kill you by just wasting them. The river had already appeared in Sudbai's sight, and the cavalry behind him did not catch up. Sudbai felt calm now, but something unexpected happened at this time. On the other side of Sudbai, a white figure appeared, holding a long sword and wearing white kung fu training clothes, but there were golden dragons embroidered on the chest and behind. The other party's temperament and look were also very familiar to Sudbai, because he had just killed a chi master, and now a second one came out. This time it was a woman. She looked to be around 40 years old, obviously a bit old. But the aura of immortality is very obvious. Generally speaking, Qi practitioners have a longer lifespan and don't look old very much. Therefore, if this woman looks 40 years old, her actual age is probably over 60, and she looks like an old woman. The woman's eyes fell on the sword on Sudbai's back, and she immediately shouted angrily. It was you who killed my apprentice. As soon as she finished speaking, the woman quickly moved towards Sudbai. Even though Sudbai was running desperately, he still couldn't get rid of the distance between her, and instead got closer and closer. When the distance between the two sides was less than 10 meters, the long sword in the woman's hand flew out and stabbed Sudbai. Sudbai had to roll to avoid the flying sword, but his running speed also slowed down. The woman was basically getting closer, and the cavalry behind him was getting closer and closer. If he really fell into it after the break, Sudbai would feel unjust. This old woman was obviously very angry and lost the mood of a chi refiner. After the flying sword flew back into her hand, it went straight towards Sudbai. Sudbai was half lying on the ground. He exerted force on his waist and slapped his hands on the ground. He rose up in the air and kicked towards the old woman. The woman turned with the sword and turned to the side of the sword. Sudbai kicked on the sword and tightened it. Then the woman slapped her palm on the hilt of the sword, a trembling sound was heard, and the sword shook. Sudbai felt his legs go numb, and he fell to the ground. The woman did not hesitate, stepped forward, and stabbed Sudbai in the chest with her sword. Bapi had been held in Sudbai's hand, and he swept it out immediately. The dagger and the long sword collided. The opponent's strength was obviously stronger. In terms of strength, Sudbai had an overwhelming advantage. Sudbai feeling pain in his wrist and tiger's mouth, Bapi took off his hand and flew out. The opponent's sword tip was also moved away, but it still stabbed Sudbai on the left side of the lower abdomen. It was like Sudbai was nailed to the ground. Sudbai subconsciously began to prepare to switch to the zombie state. However, just when Sudbai's eyes showed a touch of green, a paper talisman flew out of the woman's palm and was directly attached to Sudbai's forehead. A suppressive force penetrated Sudbai's whole body, and the evil spirit of the zombie was directly beaten back. Sudbai's body was lifted, but it was pressed back to the ground heavily. The other person obviously knows him well and has obviously been observing him and others for a long time. Sudbai was shocked. If the Westerners hadn't suddenly appeared to disrupt the situation, he probably wouldn't have been able to kill the chi refiner. You killed my apprentice, haha, I won't make it easy for you. I won't give you a happy life. I want your life to be worse than death. The woman looked very hysterical. Immediately afterwards, the cavalrymen rushed over, and some of them dismounted and locked Sudbai with chains. You are not allowed to tear the talisman on his forehead, and you are not allowed to kill him. The woman left these words and quickly left. Obviously, she had other goals and other prey. And Sudbai. Just one of those caught. The talisman paper on his forehead had a terrible suction force. From Sudbai's own feeling, it was stronger than sticking it with 502 glue, and it almost grew with his own flesh. This made Sudbai feel that Fatty's method of applying talismans was simply a world away from this. Along the way, Sudbai was blindfolded and locked in an iron cage. Then Sudbai could feel that a ship should be transporting him, because he heard the sound of water and felt the shaking of the ground. That woman did not intend to give herself a good time, but chose to slowly burn herself. This was good news for Sudbai. As long as Fatty and the others could bring the little guy into the demon cave before he was burned to death, then the story of this time is over, and I will be called back to the real world and leave this damn place. These Manchuchi practitioners are indeed very powerful, but they are nothing compared to the terrifying broadcasts. However, they traveled for about 7 days until Sudbai changed from water to land, and swayed on the carriage for another 2 days. Everything here is still so real. After they took off the black cloth on their heads and locked themselves in a cage made entirely of fine iron, Sudbai suddenly felt a little ridiculous. It's been nearly 10 days. What kind of plane are Fatty and the others doing? It's been 10 days and they haven't brought the child into the demon cave yet? In 10 days, no matter how inefficient the menopausal old woman is, everything should be handled, and she should be back soon. Could it be that I really want to experience the top 10 things of the Qing dynasty in the hands of that old woman? What does torture feel like? This. It's really interesting. Hey. At this moment, there was an iron cage next door to Sudbai, 1 meter away. There was an old man wearing Confucian clothes, but the old man was treated much better than Sudbai, and there were no chains on him. Kind of thing, and he was holding a book in his hand, and there were several books and writing brushes on the ground. There was even a jug of wine. As for Sudbai, who was chained by 7 or 8 chains, with his feet dangling in the air, the treatment of both parties was indeed a bit irritating. Sudbai looked at the old man. His hair was disheveled, but his eyes were clear, with the attitude of an old naughty boy. Young man, I saw you smiling. It's so funny. Everyone else who came in here looked like their parents were dead, but you were the only one smiling. My parents have passed away a long time ago, Sudbai said. Oh, I'm sorry, it's my fault. The old man slapped himself gently, and then stopped chatting with Sudbai. He sat down against the iron cage and began to draw circles on the book with a brush. What are you looking at? Idle time was idle. When Sudbai thought about what would happen to him when the old woman came back, he felt a little frightened, so he also wanted to find someone to talk to relieve the pressure. Tui Beitu. The old man scratched his hair as if scratching lice, and then blew on his fingers. This Tui Beitu has been modified too many times by the previous dynasties. Those sent by the imperial court, the Qi master took me over and revised it again. Changing is more difficult than rewriting, Sudbai said. Hey, young man, what you said has touched my heart. I don't care about the previous one. Anyway, I just compile it according to the history books. Now, tisk tisk, I have to compile a story about the Qing dynasty's iron hoop and a bucket of Diefenbachia. It's so difficult to be a human being. At this time, a white figure came over. The old man immediately turned around and stayed away from Subai. The men opened the door and the old woman walked in. Subai saw a scar on her face, which really looked like Master Mija. The old woman smiled at Subai. You are lucky. I am in a bad mood right now, so I won't torture you for too long, because I will hit you harder and you won't be able to hold on for too long. I think it can be long-lasting. You can lock me here and torture me for a year and a half, making me feel worse than death every day. Only then can you relieve your hatred. After all, I killed your apprentice, right? Puff. The old man choked and then coughed deliberately to cover up. The smile on the old woman's face did not change. She stretched out her hand, holding Subai's baby. Then, not a word of nonsense. He grabbed baby and stabbed Subai in the crotch. Terror broadcast. Author, Chunji Dixiaolong. Chapter 140. Subai had imagined some scenes in his mind where he might be tortured. After all, he had been detained during the 10-day trek and had too much time to think. However, Subai never thought that this woman could be so cruel and direct. Even if she tortured Subai's body in other ways, Subai could still bear it with gritted teeth, but if she directly stabbed her vital part with a knife, how could it be so? As tough as Subai was, he felt a chill in his heart. But at this moment, the old man next door flicked his brush on the tree. The old woman's hand suddenly stopped, and baby tilted it slightly. Instead of piercing Subai's vital part, it penetrated into Subai's thigh. Are you interested in this boy? The female Qigong practitioner looked at the old man. The old man shook his head and said sadly, I just don't want to feel so sorry. What are you regretting? The female Qi refiner was a little confused. What's a pity is that just for me and you to talk a few more words, one person can go from death to life. This is a very interesting thing, isn't it? The female Qi refiner let go of her hand and let Bai Pai prick onto Subai's leg. Then she looked around and laughed. Are you talking about him? Can he survive? Do you know where this is? Of course I know. The old man's eyes seemed a little hollow. His words had a profound meaning. The female Qi refiner meant that this was a heavenly prison built by the imperial court specifically for the Qi refiners who were enshrined there. It was a heaven in the true sense. Prison, once you enter this place, no one can get out unless the female Qi refiner wants to. However, the old man is looking at this world. If the supreme being of this world wants that young man to go out, what is a mere heavenly prison? Okay, then I want you to see it with your own eyes. You may be mistaken sometimes. The female Qi refiner swung her palm and hit Subai directly on the forehead. She did not intend to play or torture anymore, but wanted to kill Subai with one blow, so that what the old man just said was completely reduced to a sentence. Shit. However, just before the female Qi alchemist's hand fell, a white light suddenly enveloped Subai. Subai disappeared instantly. The female alchemist's hand was still suspended in mid-air, looking at the strange scene in front of her with a look of disbelief. The old man smiled and began to write randomly on the book in front of him. What he wrote was not something to push back, but his own doubts and verifications about the world he lived in. Now, the best evidence has appeared in front of him, he wants to record it, even if this kind of recording may be just a futile effort. The female alchemist broke the chain of the iron cage with one palm. Her palms were bleeding and bloody, which was enough to show her madness at this time. When she saw that the old man was still writing furiously, she roared. Tell me what's going on. The old man finished writing, threw the brush on the ground, tore up the book and scattered it around, then laughed loudly. Look at everything around you, as a product of failure, it will be erased. Our home, our existence, and everything we see are actually an attempt by that existence. Now it has been proven that its attempt failed, and we, and everything around us, will no longer exist. It is necessary to go down. Buzz. Subai suddenly felt a desperate suffocation, as if the whole world had gone away from him. A feeling of despair came over his heart, and his eyes, ears, mouth, and nose were covered with liquid. Immediately, a hand stretched out from the water, grabbed Subai's shoulder, and lifted it up. Subai's body felt light, air, fresh air. His vision gradually changed from blurry to clear. In the end, Subai finally saw his surroundings clearly. It was a hot spring pool with waiters walking around. Subai covered his face with a bath towel and finally relaxed. "What's wrong with you? Are you being tortured?" The monk's voice sounded next to Subai. Subai didn't say anything. He couldn't say that there was only a thin line separating him from a man to a eunuch. Subconsciously, Subai remembered something and reached out to touch under the pool. Sure enough, he touched something cold, Bapi. Bapi was stabbed in Subai's leg by the female chi refiner before, but he was also stabbed in the leg. Sent back together. No matter what, let's not talk about the harvest of story points in the story world this time. With this 100 pies in hand, it is no longer a loss. The poor monk was worried before that you wouldn't last this long. The monk said with a hint of apology, "Fortunately, you are not dead." Subai's mind was now clear, so he tore the towel away and threw it into the pool. Why so long? Yes, why so long, a whole 10 days. If he hadn't happened to kill the female Qigong master's apprentice, and the other party wanted to torture him to vent his anger, he might not be alive now. After we got rid of those chi refiners and Qing soldiers, we went to the demon cave. The monk began to tell. However, we thought we could complete the task relatively easily, but some accidents happened. Subai, do you still remember that when we first entered the story world, we encountered the carriage escorted by a group of Qing soldiers? You mean, that resentful baby? Yes, we originally planned to bypass the resentful baby directly, but that night, the man who had been holding the child carried the child to the hot spring pavilion when Gyatso and I were not paying attention. Is he a fat man? Subai said. It's him, the monk confirmed. He hid it very well. In fact, the poor monk should have discovered it a long time ago. This has nothing to do with you and everything to do with me. You didn't know Fatty before, but I did. I should have noticed when the story world released the announcement this time. The names that I can see, the names that the three of us can see each other, are me, you and Gyatso. There is no fat man. Under normal circumstances, if I know him, his name should be revealed, not someone vague and invisible. His main mission is different from what we estimate. However, main mission 1 should be the same, but main mission 2 is different. His main mission 2 should not be to send the child to the demon cave, but send it to the hot spring pavilion. When the monk said this, his tone was obviously lower. Obviously, this incident also triggered the anger in his heart, which has not been eliminated. The monk's character is still emotional about this matter, which is enough to show that the fat man what a huge blow to the monk's temporary betrayal. What happens next? Subai asked. The fat man brought the child into the hot spring pavilion. After completing his mission, he was teleported away. Gyatso and I spent a long time to get the child back from the resentful baby. At first, we just thought that the resentful baby was lonely and wanted to find a playmate, but later we found out that he wanted to find a boarding body. Since we were all injured, we could only drag and hold on. So it took a little longer, and in the end, when the resentful baby started to prepare to seize the body, the poor monk and Gyatso put all their efforts into fighting the resentful baby. Both sides suffered losses. To be honest, the poor monk was already desperate at that time, because the resentful baby, before being beaten to death by the poor monk and Gyatso, they used a curse to imprison us in the hot spring pavilion. We no longer have the strength to break out like last time. Subai was silent for a while and asked, How was the mission accomplished? It was the child who climbed out of the hot spring pavilion, climbed down the cliff, climbed into the demon cave, and triggered the completion of the mission. When the monk said this, he took a deep breath and recited, Amitabha. Obviously, even though there are tens of millions of monks, in the end, a child with a tender and fair body crawled over the hard, rough place full of sharp stones with his own hands and knees, and climbed down the cliff on his own initiative. What a scene it would be like to enter a demon cave full of evil spirits. Sudbai took a deep breath, then clenched his fist tightly in his hand. Monk, do you think I'm being pretentious? Sudbai's voice was trembling. I had planned to take him to the demon cave before. This was the result we wanted, but when I knew he was when a person climbed over on his own initiative, I felt like, haha, I really felt uncomfortable. Amitabha, the same goes for the poor monk. Even before he was born, the poor monk wanted to eat him. Do you still want to continue soaking? Gyatso, who was wearing a bathrobe, came over. Then he looked at Sudbai, hesitated, and then said, I'm sorry, I didn't send him the last moment procedure. I was sorry for him. He took the initiative to go down to Fulong Mountain with me because he trusted me. In the end, I even betrayed him personally and took him into the demon cave, but he had to do it alone. Sudbai came out of the hot spring pool, and the three of them put on their bathrobes and left the hotel club. When they entered the elevator, Sudbai was still a little distraught. The monk and Gyatso stood beside Sudbai and said nothing. The elevator door opened, and the three of them walked to their respective rooms. The monk first opened the door of his room with the door card, and then, a furry thing poked its head out. It was a black fox. The monk looked a little surprised. He didn't expect that this fox would be brought out of the story world by him. However, the monk sensed it and shook his head. The fox is still the same fox, but it has lost all its spirituality and has become a stupid creature. Sudbai's heart suddenly burned with an ardent hope, and then he immediately swiped his card and pushed open the door of his room. The monk hugged the fox and followed Gyatso. Obviously, they also wanted to take a look at this time, since the fox, if we can come out together, is it possible for that child to be born too? However, the greater the expectation, the greater the disappointment. Sudbai's room was empty and there were no children at all. Gyatso and the monk sighed, exited Sudbai's room, and helped close the door. Sudbai bit his lip and his eyes began to moisten. But this time, when he was alone, he did not choose to endure it. Instead, he lay on the big bed of the five-star hotel and let his tears begin to fall. Perhaps, at this time, I can only shed a few tears for that little guy. If I even shed tears, then I am too useless. Although, I am indeed a scumbag. Compared with the little guy who took the initiative to crawl to the demon cave to save me, I am really a pile of dirty and smelly mud on the ground. At this time, a chubby, white, and tender little hand suddenly stretched out from the quilt. Terror broadcast. Author, Chunji Dixiaolong. Chapter 141. Chapter 141. Today Long is coming home. The distance from Chengdu to Jiangsu is half of China. If I can make it today, I will update the code in the evening. If I don't make it, I will make it up tomorrow. My best regards. Don't panic, hold on tight to the dragon. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Terror broadcast. Author, Chunji Dixiaolong. Chapter 142. The white and tender little hand stretched out from the quilt, and wiped the tears from the corners of Sudbai's eyes very greenly. Sudbai was stunned, turned his head, then got up, grabbed the edge of the quilt with both hands, and carefully opened it. The little guy wearing only a red belly band covered his face with his hands, then slowly moved his hands away, looking at Sudbai, laughing while kicking his little meaty legs. Subai was also laughing, and so was the little guy. They were both laughing together. The little guy opened his little arms to Subai. "Please give me a hug." Subai opened his arms, hugged him in his arms, and pressed his face against his. Coming out of a story world, Subai's beard hadn't been shaved for a long time, and the thorns on the little guy's tender face made him itchy, but Subai could tell that the little guy really liked him. He didn't like the monk, nor did he like Gyatso, because both of them had planned to eat them. Therefore, Subai could be sure that when he took the initiative to crawl to the demon cave, it was definitely for himself, not for the monk and the others. There were even some things that the monk didn't say, but Subai could imagine that the monk must have told the little guy that he could only save himself if he entered the demon's cave. The little guy was put on the bed by Subai. As a result, he bit one of his fingers and gently kicked Subai's chin with his little foot. Subai pretended to be angry and turned the little guy over, gently touching the little guy's buttocks. If someone who knew Subai saw this scene, they would probably be shocked. Subai was absolutely cruel and ruthless, whether in the real world or in the story world. Even people like the monk were so cruel. He couldn't control him, and he made his face look gray. But at this time, Subai was like an ordinary father playing with his children. The picture was so warm that it was a bit unbearable. Meow. Outside the window, a cat meowed. Subai almost forgot that there was actually a cat beside him. Jixiang jumped in from the balcony leisurely, holding a plastic bag in his mouth, with 2 bags of milk in it. I think the fox that came to the little guy and the monk should have been teleported out at the same time as himself and others. At that time, Subai and others were in the hot spring pool of the hotel club, and the little guy and the black fox appeared in Subai and others respectively. In the monk's guest room. Ji Xiang was always in the guest room. Subai was a little surprised that this cat, which always maintained a cold demeanor, was actually willing to go and get milk for the little guy to drink. Subai took the bag from Ji Xiang's mouth. The 2 bags of milk were still warm. He gently made a small hole in one corner with his fingers, and then Subai handed the milk to the little guy. The little guy is really smart. He holds the nipple with both hands and keeps sucking on it. His little feet are pointing upward and he keeps rolling left and right. He is having a great time eating and playing at the same time. Subai changed his clothes and shaved. When he was almost dressed, there was a knock on the door of the room. It was the monk. "What's wrong?" Subai asked with his toothbrush in his mouth. "Have a meal." "Oh, wait a minute." Subai finished cooking the last bits and walked out of the bathroom while wiping his face. The little guy was lying on the bed, holding Ji Xiang's tail in one hand. Ji Xiang was not even angry, he just sat on the bed and let the little guy play with his tail. This made Subai feel a little surprised. It seemed that Jixiang, the aloof cat, was really good to the little guy. "We're going down first." "Come down after you finish it," the monk shouted to Subai inside, and he probably went down together with Gyatso. Subai walked to the bed, picked up the little guy, and said to Ji Xiang, "We are going to eat, will you go?" Jixiang sat motionless on the bed. He had always been indifferent to human food. Subai was not surprised. However, the little guy was a little anxious when the kitten refused to go. He was a little reluctant to let the kitten get milk for him. His eyes were red, as if he wanted to cry. Ji Xiang looked at the little guy, and finally jumped out of bed and came to Subai's feet. When the little guy saw Jixiang following him, he clapped his little fleshy hands happily. After taking the elevator downstairs, there is catering service downstairs in the hotel. A 5-star hotel in a scenic area has put a lot of thought into this aspect, and there are also Qiang folk performances. Of course, the show was actually quite simple. There were only a dozen men and women wearing Qiang and Tibetan costumes singing and dancing. Sudbai remembered that there was a performance of Josi's Eternal Love, but it was not in a hotel, but in an independent place outside. In the performance hall, the performance was naturally much better than the current one. Of course, the performance here is just to entertain the guests who are eating. Everyone just wants to have fun, and there are no other requirements that are so high. The monk and Gyatso were originally sitting at the round table outside. When they saw Sudbai actually holding a child and bringing the black cat down with him, both Gyatso and the monk were surprised. It didn't matter if he had children with him. The most important thing was that he had pets with him. When the waiter came over, Sudbai directly asked for a private room on the second floor. Then he waved to the monk and Gyatso, went straight to the second floor, and sat down. Putting the little guy on the chair, Jixiang also jumped on the chair and sat with the little guy. The little guy held Jixiang in his hands and rubbed it. Jixiang closed his eyes and seemed to be enjoying it very much. After a while, the monk and Gyatso also came up and saw the little guy. The monk put his hands together and recited Amitabha. But the little guy pouted and deliberately did not look at the monk. It seemed that his bad impression of the monk would not go away for a while. After all, he was only a child, and his thoughts were relatively clear, unlike Sudbai. As an old Yashao, no matter how much everyone plotted against each other before, in the end they could still sit and eat together laughing. Jixiang sensed the little guy's rejection of the monk, stood up slightly and stared at the monk with a deep look in his eyes. For a moment, the monk stood there, neither sitting nor standing. Apparently, he was a little paralyzed by the cat's sudden hostility and even murderous intent. Jixiang is Lichi's cat, and Sudbai hasn't seen through it until now. This guy is always lazy, and I haven't really seen him take it seriously, but it seems that Jixiang's attitude towards the little guy is very serious. Seriously, the little guy even had the intention to kill the monk just because he hated the monk. Sudbai reached out, touched Jixiang's head, and comforted it. Jixiang then looked away from the monk and curled up on the chair. The little guy actually followed Sudbai's example and reached out to touch Jixiang's head. The monk breathed a long sigh of relief, but instead of sitting down, he took the initiative to come over. Sudbai, let the poor monk pray for him. When Sudbai heard this, he was a little surprised. It was probably because the situation in the story world had not been completely resolved, and he always felt that the monk had some special ideas. The monk was also able to understand Sudbai's concerns and said, with this cat here, the poor monk can't do anything else. It's just a simple baptism and blessing, which can bless him with happiness and health in the future. Sudbai nodded. If the monk sincerely baptizes and prays for the little one, it is indeed a great blessing. From ancient times to the present, only famous nobles are qualified to ask eminent monks to baptize their children. And although the monk has a deep city, but he is indeed an eminent monk with good moral principles. His baptism and blessing are really an opportunity that can only be encountered but cannot be sought. Gyatso also came over at this time and said, anyway, I owe him a life-saving grace, and I'm here to pray for him. A Tibetan eminent monk and a Central Plains eminent monk are willing to pray for the little guy, no matter they still think about eating the little guy in the story world. In short, from now on, it is indeed a big opportunity. Sudbai naturally would not refuse, and the monk was right. If they really had no good intentions, Jixiang would be able to sense it. This cat's spiritual sense was more terrifying than he imagined. He reached out and put the little guy on the table. The little guy was a little confused and looked at Sudbai subconsciously. Don't be afraid, this is good for you, Sudbai comforted, and then signaled to the monk and Gyatso that they could start. A truly enlightened monk has a certain number of prayers for children in his life, usually no more than 3, so the quota is very precious. Sudbai really felt that maybe the monk and Gyatso really wanted to make up for it. Of course, The most important thing was that Subai had also felt the harm he had caused to this little guy before. The scene of the little guy crawling alone on the cliff and actively entering the demon cave also touched them greatly. Maitreya Bodhisattva's mantra, Buddhaim Dime Stita. The Buddhist scriptures say that whether it is recited orally or recited in the mind, good deeds will arise, and there will be no obstacles and difficulties, and you can get everything you wish for, life, wealth, and long-term prosperity. Gyatso recited the mantra, and a blue light began to envelope the little guy's body. The mantra of the medicine master glazed light Buddha, Dayadha Wengbe looks at Jabe looks at Jamahabe looks at Jariza Samu and Jade Stud. According to Buddhist scriptures, as long as you recite the mantra, you can not only eliminate disasters and prolong your life, but also eliminate all disasters and diseases, and gain immeasurable merits. The monk recited this mantra, and a faint radiance condensed on the little guy's eyebrows. The little guy looked left and right. He was a little panicked, but seeing no movement from Subai and no movement from the kitten, he just sat on the table obediently and accepted the blessing. The prayer lasted for a quarter of an hour, and both the monk and Gyatso turned pale. It was obvious that this kind of prayer was very costly to them, and it was enough to show that they at least did not hold anything back this time. After it was over, Gyatso and the monk both sat on the chairs and began to calm down and recover. Subai pulled open the little guy's belly band and found that there were 2 marks on the little guy's belly. One was a Buddhist swastika mark, and the other was a wolf head mark. These 2 guys are really willing to give up. This is not just as simple as praying for blessings. If the little guy encounters any danger in the future, he can even borrow the power of Gyatso and the monk, and this power will follow the future realms of Gyatso and the monk. It is getting bigger and bigger with improvement, and Subai also feels that the possibility of one of these 2 guys becoming a Buddha in the future is really high. At this time, even Ji Xiang's eyes towards the monk became softer. Only the little guy first lowered his head and looked at his belly, then reached out and touched it. When he found that he couldn't wipe it off, he blinked and cried. Too ugly. After arriving home, Long had slept until now. Then he got up and started typing to see if he could update 5 chapters in one go. There was no need to set an update time. Long would upload it as soon as he finished writing. Terror Broadcast. Author, Chunji Disyao Long. Chapter 143. The waiter was knocking on the door, because Subai had locked the door before. After all, 2 eminent monks had prayed for the little guy before. This kind of thing was considered very serious and could not be disturbed. Subai went to open the door. The waiter complained a little about why he locked the door without saying anything else. He handed the menu to Subai. Subai looked at the menu casually, sketched some, and handed it back. Want a drink? Just some drinks. Okay, all right. The waiter left, and Subai sat back down. The little guy was still rubbing his belly, but it couldn't be rubbed away. He looked very aggrieved. His expression would probably make the monk sitting opposite him almost collapse. Internal injuries occurred with Gyatso. The food didn't come out very quickly. After all, there were a lot of customers here. Fortunately, there were performers singing outside, so it wasn't boring at all. At this moment, Subai's cell phone rang. It was a call from Shanghai, an unknown number. Subai answered the phone. Hey, is this Brother Xiaobai? Subai frowned slightly. He was thinking about the connection between this voice and himself. The name Brother Xiaobai should be the name given to him by the girls in his family who are younger than him. Of course, later, after Subai's parents had an accident, Subai gradually drifted away from his parents. They had no intention of continuing to get close to Subai, except for his aunt. Well, aunt. Subai suddenly remembered who the voice was. It was his aunt's daughter, and she could also be considered his cousin. Xiao, it's you, what's wrong? Brother Xiaobai, where are you now? This side of Josega Valley. Humph, I want to go too. Can you take me with you next time? Okay, Subai tapped his fingers on the table. Then I have to bring one more person, brother Ziobai, I'm getting engaged. Subai was a little surprised. If he remembered correctly, his cousin might not even be 20 years old. She was probably just an adult. She was about to get engaged now. It was so fast. However, it is normal for girls in such families to have their marriages arranged very early. As for the legal age for marriage, ordinary families can still use money and connections to get a marriage certificate, let alone a family of this level. Yes, then congratulations, Subai said. Well, I wanted to invite you to my engagement ceremony. I told my mother to invite you, but I didn't want to call you, so I had to call you. Brother Ziobai, you won't come. Bar. Subai also knew that the reason why her aunt was unwilling to call him to invite her was because her aunt knew that she did not want to have too much contact with relatives from both families, and her cousin's engagement ceremony would definitely be a gathering of relatives and friends. A lot of. Fortunately, at this time, Subai seems to have experienced so many story worlds, and the original obsession with himself is indeed not that heavy now. Although from the bottom of his heart, he still does not want to have too much contact with his so-called relatives. However, since it is the engagement of my aunt who is the best to me, I might as well go ahead. Send me the date and I'll be there. Well, okay, brother Ziobai is the best. The cousin hung up the phone, and Subai put the phone on the table. At this time, he suddenly realized that he hadn't checked out the story points he had gained this time. It was also because of the little guy's appearance that Subai had indeed ignored it. For other things, for Subai, bringing the little guy out from the last story world was already a big gain. Although Subai still doesn't know why the little guy and the black fox can be brought out from the story world until now. When he came out, Bapi's dagger was pierced into his thigh. It was reasonable for him to be teleported out together, but the little guy crawled to the demon cave on his own. Subai took out his mobile phone, and sure enough, the public account Kongbu66 on WeChat had issued a notice, and there were several messages. One of them was that the horror broadcast was going to be suspended for 3 months for rectification, which made Subai was very surprised, and at the same time he couldn't help but feel relaxed, because it meant that he could stay in the real world for 3 months, which was a bit similar to the feeling of students having winter and summer vacations. Subsequently, Subai clicked on the column where story points were allocated. In that column, his contribution to main task 1 was 85%, and he received a reward of more than 200 story points. Main task 2's the contribution distribution is actually 20%. There are less than 100 story points. In total, it is almost 300 story points. Counting the early 800 story points that I saved before, I now have 1001 story point. A smile appeared at the corner of Subai's mouth. Hellfire shotgun. It's ready for redemption. Is there anything you are happy about? The monk asked. Apparently, he mistakenly thought that Subai had received the call and said congratulations, thinking that there was something happy. Subai nodded. His phone had entered the official account's WeChat store, and he clicked on the Hellfire shotgun to confirm the redemption. 1,000 story points were instantly deducted from Subai. Subai felt as if he had worked hard for decades and returned to before liberation in one night. Fortunately, everything was worth it. The attack power of his vampire blood was too weak. And although the zombie bloodline has good defense and attack power, it has too many limitations and is shackled and suppressed in too many ways. For example, the female alchemist can almost completely paralyze her zombie bloodline with just a piece of talisman. Taoist priests, monks, Western light magicians or warlocks, etc., can restrain the existence of zombie bloodline. There are too many. Sometimes in the story world, the external manifestations of the zombie bloodline are too exaggerated and sensational, and are not suitable for use. 2 shotguns appeared in front of Subai and were placed quietly on the table. This surprised Subai. 2 handfuls. A set of 2, 1,000 story points, this is an unexpected surprise. The 2 shotguns didn't look very fancy, but their restrained auras showed that they were extraordinary. Subai stretched out his hands and picked up the 2 guns. The gun was not very heavy, and even seemed very light, but the hard and solid feeling made Subai feel very clearly. Subconsciously, Subai pointed the gun downwards and knocked hard on a marble stand next to him. Boom! There was a big hole missing in the marble. This is not the power of the ammunition, but simply the power of hitting the gun with a blunt object. Originally, Gyatso wasn't too surprised when he saw 2 shotguns coming out, but when Subai took a gun and smashed a marble corner, his eyes twitched, and then he took out his mobile phone. When he found the prototype of this gun in the WeChat store, he looked at the exchange price and couldn't laugh or cry, and then handed it to the monk to look at. After reading it, the monk had almost the same expression as Gyatso. A weapon with 1,000 story points is really luxurious. Gyatso was a little surprised and said, "You actually saved so many story points?" Most of the listeners with a task completion score of May 10 not have as good a weapon as you. Indeed, it is not easy for the audience to obtain story points, and once you have saved enough, you will immediately need to strengthen your bloodline and skills. In addition, you need to buy some other auxiliary props. It is not easy to spend 1,000 story points. It is difficult for anyone to get it. It is too luxurious to be able to save it and just exchange it for a weapon. I have no other use for it, Subai explained a little vaguely, and then subconsciously pulled the trigger towards the window. No response. The singing outside was very loud, but Subai was still in the window of the private room on the 2nd floor, so he dared to test the gun directly here so brazenly, but when the trigger was pulled, there was no sound at all, which made Subai very surprised. Accident. Could it be a soul attribute attack weapon? So there is no physical effect? Gyatso was originally waiting for the gun to fire, but when it didn't go off, he suddenly realized something and said directly, "You didn't redeem the bullets, did you?" Bullet, Subai was a little surprised. Yes, bullet. He took out his mobile phone, and sure enough, in the column behind the Hellfire shotgun, there was an exchange for bullets, and the price was 50 story points for 8 bullets. Damn, it's so expensive. In a story world, if Subai is lucky and has a high contribution rate, he can only get 200 to 300 story points. Under normal circumstances, it can only be lower, which means that he only needs to bang 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 to open more. After a few shots, the story points gained from a story mission were disintegrated into ashes. Originally, Subai had a scene in his mind where he was holding 2 guns, facing a group of people fighting in a vampire state, but now it seems that the scene is a bit unrealistic, at least for the time being, and it is impossible for his bullets to sustain it. A big battle begins. The monk and Gyatso looked at each other and clicked on their phones. Then a box of bullets wrapped in gold foil appeared in front of them. Gyatso pushed the 2 boxes of bullets in front of Subai. It's obviously a gift. Subai himself exchanged the remaining story points for 2 boxes of ammunition, for a total of 4 boxes of ammunition, 32 rounds. Subai took apart 1 round and loaded the ammunition. A gun was filled with 8 rounds, which meant that Subai's current wealth had to be added to the wealth donated by the monk and Gyatso. He could only shoot 4 rounds happily, and then he was gone. These 2 guns can only be used as fire sticks. "Are you still trying the gun?" Gyatso asked at this time. Subai shook his head. "I can't afford to try it. Let's try it when we find a chance to face a minion. If you just let it go out of thin air, it will just blow out the story points, which is a bit painful." The monk then recited Amidba. Amidba, it actually doesn't matter. Your story points have no effect on your bloodline. Moreover, some of the gains and excavations in the story world are actually far greater than those in Wadian. Monk, you can comfort people. Subai nodded, put away the 2 guns, and put them on his waist. Maybe he would have to wear a windbreaker in the future. Of course, using this kind of weapon to do missions in the story world is really distressing. If the reward for killing a boss is 100 story points, if you fire a few more shots, it will become worse than not killing. Subai. After all, coding is not something you just sit on an assembly line and do tasks. There are many things that need to be thought about and considered. Basically, one chapter takes 3 or 4 hours to complete, sometimes even longer. Everyone knows that Long's book is not that kind of thing. It is a routine article, so it requires more brain power. In short, I hope everyone can understand. Long got home in the afternoon, got up after a nap, and has been typing until now. It is estimated that he will continue typing until noon tomorrow. I will post a chapter as soon as I finish it. Long has not lazy, really not lazy.